Hello everyone and welcome back to where we've been working on FRQs. So a reminder that the AP exam this year, oh, that's a little off. Yeah, the AP exam this year is nothing but FRQs. And they even tell us that the units are going to be a little bit shorter. You're going to get one question on array or array list, and then other questions on methods and control structures. I feel like this tells you part of what we got going on. Another very important thing is here are our units, but due again to the virus, we're shortened to just this. I say all this because back at these questions that show us array and array list, methods and control structures, right? That kind of looks like there's no string, but I would be prepared for string. We're pretty fortunate in my particular class because we've covered string. I would assume that they're looking at putting string somewhere in the using objects type of area. Okay. An important note, while you don't have to have an IDE, they claim that it won't really help you. I think it will. You can have an IDE whenever you go to the test questions. All this is actually pretty good for us. It allows us to work through these FRQs. And I have another one here from 2016 for you. This one is going to ultimately involve an array list. But of note, there's also strings in it. So it can be pretty heavy on strings at certain times. I would be prepared for strings if it was me personally. So this question involves the process of taking a list of words called word list and producing a formatted string of a specified length. The list, word list, contains at least two words consisting of letters only. So we're guaranteed to have two words. That looks like a precondition to me. When the formatted string is constructed, spaces are placed in the gaps between words so that as many spaces as possible are evenly distributed to each gap. The equal number of spaces inserted into each gap is referred to as a basic gap width. Any leftover spaces are inserted one at a time in the gaps from left to right until there are no more leftover spaces. The following three examples illustrate these concepts. In each example, the list of words is to be placed into a formatted string of length 20. So what's going to happen is we're going to get a list of words. What we want ultimately is a string whose length is exactly 20. Okay, in this first example, our word list has 14 total letters. 2 plus 4 plus 3 plus 5 gives us 14. We want 20 total. So that tells us we'll have to basically have 6 spaces, but we want to distribute those kind of evenly here. Right? We have 3 total gaps. It is going to be number of words minus 1. And so with the 6 extra spaces and 3 gaps, the basic gap width is 2. Right? That one's nice and neat in terms of this example. So the basic gap width leaves us with no leftover spaces. Here we can actually kind of see it laid out. Right? In total, there are 20 characters in this string. I have the 4 words from the original word list, and there are 2 spaces in between each. Okay? Let's look at another example. Here's a word list, green eggs and ham. Total number of letters is 15. And again, we want 20 as our total. Go away. We want 20 as our total. So that leaves us with 5 spaces. Now, there are going to be 3 gaps in total. Again, it's number of words minus 1. And so that leaves us with a basic gap width of just 1. Right? I have 5 spaces I need to distribute in between these words. Our basic gap width, we're guaranteed to be able to put at least 1 space in between each word, and that leaves me with 2 leftover spaces. And so I'll go back through and distribute those. Notice that the 2 extra spaces are basically placed in order. So there's only 1 space between our last word, but the formatted string in total has 20 characters. Okay, last example, we got beach ball. Again, we want 20 total characters when it's all said and done. There are 9 here. 20 minus 9, that leaves me with 11 spaces. There's only going to be 1 gap. Well, all 11 are going to go there. Okay. You will implement 3 static methods in a class called StringFormatter that is not shown. Write the StringFormatter method total letters, which returns the total number of letters in the word in its parameter word list. For example, if the variable list string words is a frog is string formatter, we're just counting the letters. We're going to get an array list, and we want to know how many total letters are in those strings. And I say array list, it says list here, right? Array list is a list. It's beneath list in a class hierarchy. List itself is an interface. This is from 2016. The more modern FRQs have moved away from this, and they will specify array list. But let's get started. You can see I got Battleship pulled up here. I will talk about that at the end of today's stream. I'm going to go next. We'll expand it. Nope, I'm not in Battleship. Let's do our FRQs 2016. And we'll do this one is problem number 4 from 2016. Okay, they tell us that the name of the class is StringFormatter. You just see the methods, you don't see the header. There are no instance variables here. There's no constructors. We're not really using object orientation. Ultimately, these methods are static. Looking at our first one, I'm going to grab this guy and paste him in. That's a link to this thing here. Could you not let me copy? Let's slam that, Control C. Okay, we're not copying from the PDF. I could do it in Firefox yesterday. You let me down, Google. We're on number 4, part A, and I really just want to be able to copy and paste. Bruh. Okay, so we have a precondition here. I don't know if it matters that much. Interesting. Just let me do my precondition. Thank you. Precondition word list contains at least 2 words consisting of only letters, and I'm actually going to even drop that guy down to make it kind of a little bit cleaner. We got public static int total letters, and we're writing this. Now, list, right here, it's mad at me because it's not imported on the FRQ. You don't have to worry about importing. I'm going to hover over it, though, and hit Alt-Enter to import it. So it returns the total number of letters in word list. Precondition word list contains at least 2 words consisting of letters only. So ultimately, I want to count the number of letters. So I'm going to start off with a counter variable before I start looping through this. And even though it says list, you can just treat it like it's an array list. In fact, I could change this to array list, and it wouldn't really change anything. It would function the exact same way. So we're going to loop through our word list. Now, we can use a for loop. We can use a for each loop. I will use a for each loop here because ultimately we're not modifying anything. So it makes it very clean. We're going to loop through word list. Each element in our word list is a string. So we will say for each string, which we'll refer to as word in word list. All I want to do is get the current word, see how many letters are in it, add it to our count. So we're going to do count plus equals word dot length. Right? This is the same thing as saying count is equal to counts plus word dot length. And word is referring to the current word, which is a string. I can use any of string's methods. Most importantly, length will tell me how many characters are in it. All we got to do at the end is return our count. That's it. What if the word has spaces? They tell us here that it contains at least 2 words consisting of letters only. So the words themselves. Maybe that's not clear. Let's make a driver. And I'm going to go ahead and test what we got. So they give us some examples. They give us an example here, like a frog is. So why don't you know what? I'm going to do one of the examples up here because that's ultimately what we're coming back to. This one is going to be probably the easiest. Example 1, AP comp sci rocks. So let's start with that one. I'm going to create an array list Note that we could put list over here on this side. We'll call it word list. Is a new array list of string. So a couple of things here. I'm going to import, again on the FRQ, you don't have to worry about it. Assume everything is imported, everything. But there are my list and array list imports. Here on the left hand side I'm saying list. Here on the right hand side I'm saying array list. Now this works because array list is an instance of list. What I'm saying is array list instance of list. Array list is equal to or beneath list in a class hierarchy. List is ultimately an interface. It is abstract. And so I can't actually make a list. Right? If I scroll over this, it tells me list is abstract and cannot be instantiated. Another small thing, we don't actually have to put the data type over here. It's part of the reason why it's gray. What you're going to see on the AP exam is they will always put it there. Now this is gray because I haven't used it yet. Let's add some stuff to it. Word list add, and our first word, AP. Word list add. Comp. Word list add. Sci. And I know some of you are screaming at me to use collections.addAll. I will. I'll show it to you eventually. AP comp sci rocks. Is that what we add? So what I'm testing is how many letters. I have a word list. I want to test my StringFormatter method that we just wrote for part A, and I should get 14 back out of it. So we're going to call StringFormatter. It is static and in another class, and so I need to refer to that class. We're not making an object here. We're just calling the method. Total letters, and I want to know what is the total letters in our word list. Now, this is yellow because we're returning something, but we're not doing anything to it. So I'm going to salt it. I'm going to use an SOP so we can see what that is. And again, this should give me back a value of 14. Ta-da! And if we want, we can go ahead and test another example. I'll make a second word list and just kind of leave it here. And that way we can just kind of alternate between the two. Another approach I could do is just change word list. We'll take this opportunity. So we're going to make word list a new word list to effectively reset it. So there's nothing in it at this moment. And then I'm going to come in and I'm going to show you something that I've shown my students, which is the collections utility class. Now, maybe you've heard of arrays with an S. Collections is a utility class. It's nothing but static methods. Here I'm referring to the class. And you can use them with collections. Now, there's lots of collections, but the only one we actually know in AP Computer Science A is ArrayList. So this provides additional methods that you can use to help manipulate or work with ArrayList. It is free for you to use, and again, you can assume anything is imported. Whenever I do this, IntelliJ is going to import for me, but you don't have to do the import part. You could just start using collections. Now here I have add all. What I'm going to do with add all is add multiple things, so I don't have to do this. Right here I'm adding one thing at a time. Add all takes variable arguments. I want to add to my word list. And the first thing I want to add is green. Now variable arguments, I can just keep passing in here. And so this is effectively replacing this. In terms of typing, it's, it doesn't really save you that much, but it does reduce number of lines, and so if that's your jam, go for it. Now, let's see how many letters are in our word list now. So I'm going to call StringFormatter total letters in our word list. And again, word list has dropped all of this stuff and should only be this stuff. I should get 15. Let's see what we got. 14 on the first word list, then we reset word list and add new things to it, and I get 15 the second go around. So our total letters is looking pretty good. Let's look at part B. Write the string formatter method basic gap width, which returns the basic gap width as defined earlier. Okay, string formatter, we just did total letters, basic gap width, that's what we're writing now. And effectively what we want to know is we're going to have basically a certain length that we want to get. We're going to have a certain number of letters, and that'll tell us how many spaces are left over, and then we want to evenly divide those spaces amongst the gaps. So let's get our header in here. They give me a header, so I'm just going to grab that guy. Public static int, this stuff here. So I'm going to flip back to my string formatter class. I'm going to paste this bad boy in. Do they give me any type of... Aha! I'll grab this one instead. Interesting. And this should be indented to there. Get rid of that asterisk. And we'll bring this guy down and put him there. And then finally our header goes beneath all this documentation. Okay, returns the basic gap width when word list is used to produce a formatted string of formatted len characters. So they tell us here as a parameter how long they want it to be. In our examples, that was 20. And then we have this word list, and from those two parameters, we can figure out how big our basic gap width is. There's a possibility that there's going to be leftover spaces, but we'll handle that later. Precondition, word list contains at least 2 words consisting of letters only. Formatted len is large enough for all the words in gaps. Okay, so let's think about this. I know how many total letters there are going to be because we ultimately need to call this method total letters. They tell us here, assume that total letters works as specified regardless of what you wrote in part A. So even if we completely botched it, which we didn't, you can assume that it works. And you have to use it. Right? They tell us that you have to use it. So the first thing I probably want is, what is my total letters? And you could potentially save that into a variable. So here we'll save it locally. Total letters is going to be, we're going to call the method total letters, passing in our word list that we have here. That's going to give us our number back. In example number 1, that was 14. Example 2, that was 15. So now I have our total letters. I have my formatted length. We can figure out how many spaces do we need, right? Total spaces is going to be our formatted len, which should be larger, right? That should be the larger of the two numbers, minus our total letters. In our example, let's use example number 1. Total letters would have been 14, and the formatted len would have been 20. Maybe we put that here. And so the total spaces should be 6. In that exact same example, there are 4 total words. The number of spaces, however, number of gaps in between words is 3. So it is our total number of words, which is going to be the size of this array list, minus 1. So I actually know, right, how many gaps I'm going to have. I just need to basically divide these spaces over the number of gaps. I'm going to use some more variables here, right? Our total number of gaps is going to be word list.size minus 1. In example number 1, word list had 4 words in it. In total, there's 3 gaps in between those words, right? 4 minus 1. We're going to end up condensing this down, don't worry. I know you're probably going to freak out there in chat. And so what I want to do, again, this is going to be 3 based on example 1. What I want to do is divide these spaces over this. right? Ultimately, our gap width is going to be, let's make a variable for that. Basic gap width is going to be total spaces divided by gaps, right? For example 1, that'll give me 2, and ultimately, that is what I return. Let's test that. I'm going to flip back to my driver, and we're going to come back and condense this down, make it look pretty, I promise. I'll flip back to my driver. I'm going to comment out section 2 for now, or example 2. So we're working with example 1, which was AP comp sci rocks. And we know the total number of letters. What I want to know now is how big is the basic gap width. So we'll call StringFormatter basic gap width, passing in that exact same word list in a length of 20. Thank you. Total letters instead of what? Oh, here I use total letters. Thank you. Yeah, that's why my number's off. That's a big deal. Okay. I was like, there we go. Thank you. Our basic gap width is 2. And if I flip back to example 1, we can see that. There's 2 spaces in between everything, right? Our basic gap width is 2. So that looks pretty good, but what about, let's try example 2, because you'll notice that the basic gap width is 1, and I got some leftover spaces. What we're trying to get is just this number. So let's try example 2 using our same method. I'm going to flip back up to my driver. Let's copy this guy, bring it down, and I will comment back in this. Maybe we comment out all of this. So now I'm working with example 2. We are creating a array list that is our word list. We're adding to it green eggs and ham. I want to see how many total letters, which should be 15. And I want to see what the basic gap width should be, which should be 1. And we do get there. Okay? That seems a little odd, but it's actually thanks to truncation, I'm getting the right answer. Right? For example 2, our total number of letters is 15. Our total number of spaces at that point is going to be 20 minus 15, or 5. Our word size, there's still 4 words, right? So we're going to get 3 there. Am I even using this gaps? I don't even need that. Do I? Anyway, then we get our basic gap width, which is total spaces divided by 3. Now, at this point, total spaces is 5. What I have is 5 divided by, oh, I hard-coded the 3 in. This is supposed to be gaps. Interesting. So it's going to be 5 divided by 3, which is going to be some type of decimal number. Right? 5 divided by 3 gives me 1.6. Because I have division between integers, total spaces is an integer, gaps is an integer, this will get truncated to just 1. It should be 1.666 repeating, but because division between integers, it's just going to be 1. So the truncation is actually helping us here. Our basic gap width works perfectly fine now that I've changed the right things. So what I want to do now is we're making a lot of these integers, and that's just unnecessary. We can actually do it all at the point of return, right? I need to know what is our total letters, right? So we could just call the method total letters of our word list. That number is being subtracted from our formatted length. That's how we get this 5. And then once I have a 5, I just need to divide by this. Right? So we'll take that number, which is going to be a 5. We divide by our word list.size minus 1. And I could put some parentheses here to kind of make sure those things work. Right? Our formatted length, which in our examples is 20. Total number of letters in our word list, example 2, that is 15. I do this subtraction. I'm forcing it to happen because of the parentheses, right? We do the subtraction. That'll give me 5. Over here on the right-hand side, I have wordlist.size, which is 4, minus 1, which is 3. I'm doing 5 divided by 3, and that should give me the exact same basic gap width. So all those variables reduced, we can just do all this at the point of return. I'm pretty happy. Let's look at part C. Write the string formatter method format, which returns a formatted string as defined earlier. The string formatter class also contains a method leftover spaces, which has already been implemented. We'll have to write that. This method returns the number of leftover spaces as defined earlier and is shown below. I'm going to grab this bad boy, paste him in. It's not complete, but it is a header. Returns the number of leftover spaces. I don't know why they didn't. Well, I guess maybe they would. It would be like a big hint. My question is like, why didn't they just like write this out and give it to you? But I guess it's just unnecessary. It may be a big hint to other parts. So here we go. Returns the number of leftover spaces when word list is used to produce a formatted string of formatted len characters. So we're taking in the same data as the last one. We could have easily calculated leftover spaces here. Word list contains at least 2 words because it's letters only. Blah 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 blah. So our leftover spaces is essentially going to be, we need to figure out our total number of spaces, right? And we can actually get that from here. Our total number of spaces, in example 2, that was 5. Now, based on basic gap width, so I know how many gaps are supposed to be. So our basic gap width, why don't we kind of break it out into integers? So total spaces, this will help me think. Total spaces is this, right? In example 2, that's 5. Now we know our basic gap width, which is going to be 1 in example 2, and I basically want to multiply that by my number of gaps, and then subtract that from this total. I feel like I'm missing something. So our leftover spaces, we're going to take, we got our number of gaps, right? Our gaps is going to be equal to wordlist.size minus 1, and our leftover spaces is going to be our number of gaps times our basic gap width that tells me how many I've used, and I want to subtract that from my total space. Right, so our total space for example number 2 should be 5. Total space is, our gaps is going to be 3. We take our total spaces, which is 5. Our gaps is 3. Our basic gap width is 1. So this gives me 3 here. We subtract that from our total spaces. That gives us a leftover spaces of 2. And that's what we ultimately return. Let's think about it with example number 1, which my leftover spaces was 6. My number of gaps was still 3. So total spaces is 6. Our gaps is 3. And then our basic gap width was 2. 3 times 2 gives me 6. 6 minus 6 is 0, and that's correct because I had no leftover spaces for example number 1. So we can do all this at the point of return, which is your total spaces minus your gaps times your basic gap width. Let's maybe space this out some. So leftover spaces should be the total spaces minus your basic gap width times the number of gaps. Let's test that out. I'm going to flip back, and for example number 2, we actually know parentheses are needed. That's why it's highlighted in yellow. Oh, yes, I do need this math to happen, this subtraction to happen. Thank you. Otherwise, it was highlighted because there's just like one, it was doing this first, 1 times the basic gap width. That is important. Thank you. String formatter. We're going to figure out what is our leftover spaces for example number 2. And it should be 2. Okay, let's try example number 1. I'm going to bring this stuff back in. I'm going to comment this stuff out. So example 1, I should get 0 leftover spaces. Sweet. All that's looking pretty good. Now, they give you that method. We didn't have to write that, but we did. So here's the format method, which is where all the exciting stuff happens. I'm going to copy that bad boy. We'll throw it into our StringFormatter class, and then we'll talk about it. Oh my gosh. Okay, returns a formatted string consisting of the words in word list separated by spaces. Precondition, the word list contains at least 2 words consisting of only letters. Formatted len, this is part of our precondition, so let's space it over. Postcondition, all words in word list appear in the formatted string. The words appear, I don't like the inconsistencies in their formatting here. Because, I mean, this is a point, but then they do these points here. All words in the word list appear in the formatted string. The words appear in the same order in the word list. The number of spaces between words is determined by basic gap width, and the distribution of leftover spaces from left to right is as described. So we're basically taking in a array list at this point and turning it into the string that they want. We're making these things from our examples. So I have to figure out what my basic gap width is and put that in all of the gaps. I then got to come back through and put in any leftover spaces. So this ultimately returns a string. We're going to start out with a string that we plan on returning. Now, the first thing we want to do is, why don't we make some variables to clean this up? So let's get our basic gap width by calling the method, passing in the exact same word list, and our desired formatted length. Why don't we also figure out our leftover spaces? So what I want to do is loop through this word list. I want to add the word. I want to add the first word and then a space. I want to add the next word and then a space. But we want to also maybe consider adding our leftover spaces as we go until we run out of leftover spaces. Now, this tells me how big the gap should be, but it's not the gap itself. So what I need to actually do is create a string that represents my gap. And every time we do a basic gap width, what we're going to do is actually plug in this string. Okay. Now, again, I know how long it's going to be. I need to actually make it. And the easiest way to do that is with a loop. We're going to loop. We'll start I at 0 as long as I is less than basic gap width. We'll do an I++. I'm going to add to my gap a space. Gap plus equals a new space. Okay. For example 1, what I'll end up with is a gap that looks like that. It's 2 spaces. That will be the value of gap. Okay, I'm going to get rid of these braces because I don't need them. And I actually think as soon as I have my return string ready, I have my gap string ready. If this is the only place they end up using this, we can, of note, put just the method call there. However, this is going to be more efficient because I don't want to do that over and over and over again. What I'm saying is if we put the call to the method here, it looks like we'll be able to get rid of this variable, and that's better. That's what it looks like. The thing is, this is going to call that method every time the condition is checked, and that is not more efficient. We're trading off processing for space, and the amount of space that a single integer takes up is significantly less. So it's actually more efficient to do this. Now, does that matter in terms of your FRQ? No, you're okay. So, I actually think we're ready to start looping. Let's loop through our word list. For each string, which we'll refer to as word in our word list. What I want to do is add the word to my return string. So we'll say RTN plus equals the word. So in my first example, I just tacked on AP. In my second example, I would be tacking on green. What I want next is the gap string. So let's add that. Thinking about leftover spaces. I got to think about the leftover spaces. This is going to add an extra gap at the end. Why don't we actually see what we got so far? Like I can actually try this out and we can just print off what we have so far and what it looks like. Right now I'm just going to return nothing, but I want to test what I have, the format string. So whenever I call this method, it's going to start out with an empty string. We'll figure out our basic gap width. We'll create the gap string based off that. We then have our leftover spaces, which we're not even worried about at the moment. And then we'll loop through our word list, adding the word followed by a gap. And what's going to happen is I'm going to have an extra gap at the end. And that's okay. Let's see what it looks like so far. I'm going to try it out with example 1. Let's out on StringFormatter.format, which again, that's not going to actually print off anything. But inside the method itself, there is an SOP, which will show us what our string looks like so far. So we got AP comp sci rocks. You notice there should be 2 spaces there, 2 spaces there, 2 spaces there. But as you've talked about in chat, there's actually 2 spaces there, which is an incorrect result. That's because we're just adding spaces after every word. This could actually be, by the way, simplified to just that. Now, what I think is kind of a big brain approach is why don't we just get rid of, like go ahead and add the gap and then get rid of it. There's two ways to approach this. One is to prevent it. That is, don't add the gap to begin with, but you have to basically check for that using some type of if statement. The other is add the gap, but then roll it back. And I actually think that tends to be easier. And yes, the way to handle that is substring. RTN is going to be a substring of itself. We're going to begin at index 0, and we're going to go through the rest of the string and then backtrack based on the gap. So it's its current length minus gap.length. Let's try that. So I got AP comp sci rocks. It looks pretty good. You'll notice I can't actually highlight there. So this got rid of the last 2 spaces. This is my preferred approach, is to do the rollback. Now all we got to do is handle the leftover spaces, because if I flip to example 2, all right, let's bring in this bad boy, and we'll comment out all of this. And I'll comment out this. So I'm creating my array list. We're adding in green eggs and ham, and I just want to format it for now. Again, there's an SOP inside of the format string. We got green eggs and ham. There are no excess spaces, which is good, but there's only one space in between each gap based off the basic gap width. So the last thing I need to handle is these leftover spaces. You got ideas? Right? Because this should have one and this should have one, but not this. And I think it is as simple as if leftover spaces is greater than 0, let's add a space to the return string. Right? This is happening for each word. Yes. This should only be one space at a time. My problem was just like, what if multiple spaces need to get added to a word? But if that was the case, it would have got handled by the basic gap width. So this is good. If there are spaces to add, let's add it. RTN plus equals one additional space. We also then need to subtract one from our leftover spaces. I'm going to take out this SOP here. Let's return RTN. So here is our strategy. We're looping through our word list. With each word, we'll add it to the string that we plan on returning, along with a basic gap. If there's leftover spaces to add, I add exactly one and get rid of that. And we do that for each word. Eventually, this should run out. Let's try this. Ta-da! Here we have green eggs and ham. There are 2 spaces here, 2 spaces here based on basic gap and leftover spaces. However, there's only one here because we've distributed the 2 and we run out by the time we hit here. There are no spaces after the fact there. I'm going to plug in example 3 because I want to make sure that one works. Easiest thing to do is just let's backtrack this stuff. And so we're going to do collections.addAll to our word list, and 3 consists of beach ball. Beach ball. I then want to format. This will tell me if everything works because format ultimately uses all of the methods. We're going to format based on this word list, and we want a formatted length of 20 based on these examples. I should have beach ball with 11, I believe, spaces in between. No extra spaces over here. I'll give you a still image of this. And we're going to wrap it up there. So Battleship, let's just say it's going to take place tomorrow. I've been working on the driver, trying to get some kinks out, and I worked on it a lot, actually, recently. And basically, it was just like, I got frustrated with it. Because one of the things I want to do is keep track of wins. And the idea is, like, where do you store that? It could just be in integers. It could be in the players themselves. But I also want players to alternate, and I want to be able to kind of display the score as it goes, and that's a problem whenever players are alternating, right? How do you display scores? Is it always based on the player's name, or is it based on play? Anyway, I want to get those kinks out. I want to make sure that everything's good to go. I want to make sure that I've got a visual bracket that I can show on the screen. I just want to get the kinks out. We do have 16 people that have submitted, although fairly certain some people just submitted random AIs. That's okay. We can shoot for tomorrow. So I'll see you guys tomorrow for our Battleship AI competition. For now, let's chill.